Hey, in this video, I thought I would share with you guys a success story about someone who took a psychiatric medication. And I feel like if you've watched my channel for some time, you know that I prefer that we use psychiatric medications as a last resort, but oftentimes, especially antipsychotics, we misuse, abuse, and overuse them. And I thought that this story would be kind of unique for my channel because I often don't talk about success stories as they relate to medications. And this story that I'm about to share with you is something that happened completely spontaneous. I randomly ran into one of my old patients who used to be a patient or he is still a patient at the state hospital. I used to work at the state hospital. Randomly bumped into him and I was like, hey, is this guy? I think it might be him. And we struck up a conversation and he told me something that I thought was absolutely surprising, and given his history, it was probably one of the last things I expected him to ever say to me. So let me share with you the story. And by the way, if you're new to my channel, my name's Nick. I'm a nurse. I make vids about mental health and things related to mental health. All right, so I am currently a nurse at a correctional facility. So I pull up to this correctional facility to park to start my shift. And about a block or two away from this correctional facility is a state hospital. In Colorado, we've got a lot of state facilities located next to each other. We've got a lot of correctional facilities located next to each other, and we have a state hospital that's located close to the correctional facility that I'm working at. So I go to pull up, and I see this guy, and I'm like, man, he looks really familiar. And I'm like, oh my God, is that Bob? Not his real name, of course, but I'm like, that might be Bob from the state hospital. I was like, I have to check in with him because he and I were very close. We had a very close relationship when I worked on his unit. And so I get out of my car and I'm like, Bob? And he looks over and he's like, yeah. He's like, who's that? I'm like, do you remember me? He's like, yeah, I remember you. I was like, do you remember my name? He's like, no, remind me of your name. I'm like, my name's Nick. He's like, oh man, how's it going? So we strike up this conversation. So let me tell you a little bit about Bob before I tell you the thing that he shared with me that was really surprising. So Bob is probably in his mid-20s. He was at the state hospital on a unit that most of the patients there, I would say probably, if not, maybe all the patients there were diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. That was their main diagnosis. And then I think we had some of those patients probably had a little bit of like bipolar, maybe some mood disorders. There might have been some mild schizophrenia. I think there was one patient on there actually who was, I would say, moderately schizophrenic. But for the most part, they were all diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. One of my favorite units to work on. And if you're not familiar with antisocial personality, it doesn't mean that they don't like to socialize. In fact, a lot of antisocial personality people do like to socialize. There's other things that go on with that diagnosis, but they're very, in fact, oftentimes people who are diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder are often very charismatic. And so I feel like I got along with a lot of the patients on that unit and we'd have kind of interesting conversations. They're very high functional. In fact, if you were to meet a lot of them, you probably couldn't tell that anything was really off because they present very well. It's only after talking to them for some time that you realize, these people tend to lack empathy. They tend to lack remorse for what they've done. They don't really seem to care about others, things like that. So Bob was on that unit. I didn't really get antisocial vibes from him, but he was a curious character in that he would oftentimes spend the mornings in his room. He wasn't medicated. He was prescribed, I think, 5, maybe 10 milligrams of Zyprexa, which is an antipsychotic medication. And he would always refuse that medication. And I remember him being very frustrated with the psychiatrist because she felt like he really needed that medication and yet he did not want to take it. And we had a lot of discussions about that. And so Bob, the only thing that really kind of stuck out with me is that he had fairly pressured speech, would kind of talk quickly. And he had a very rapid mind. Not that he was tangential, like moving from topic to topic, but he was just very quick to speak about whatever was on his mind. And things that he would speak about were often associated with one another. It's not like he was just randomly bouncing around here and there, but was very fun to listen to. Had a lot of interesting things to say. And Bob and I... Actually, let me talk more about kind of his characteristics that were sort of unique. Another thing that he would do is he often would twirl his hair. He had very long hair that was sort of mangled. He liked to twirl his hair a lot. He was somewhat emaciated, kind of on the lower end of a BMI, like BMI maybe 17 or 18. If you're not too familiar with BMI, it's the body mass index. Anywhere from like 20 to 25 is considered regular. 25 to 30 is overweight. 30 plus, I think, is obese, if I'm remembering right. Don't quote me on these numbers. But anything below 20 On a BMI scale, you start to worry a little bit about anorexia and whether or not the patient, especially like in a psychiatric setting, is eating enough. And so oftentimes they're very emaciated. You can see their ribs. And with Bob specifically, I mean, he's even today, he's very bony. He looks like his BMI now is probably healthier. He's probably like right around 20, whereas before I think he was sitting around like 17 or 18. And he would often just refuse to eat. He would just say he wasn't hungry. But I don't think there was anything really that dysfunctional about it. I think it was more of a control thing for Bob. I think that by refusing to eat, that was something that he could refuse that he was in control of. And when you're in a state hospital, you don't have much control as a patient, and so it feels good to have control over something. And I think for Bob, his diet was that something. Other than those things though, I don't really think there was too much else that really stuck out to me about Bob. I would say that once in a while when we were talking, he seemed to get a little distracted, like he was lost in thought. And that is pretty common with people who have schizophrenia, because they're either hearing a voice or they're seeing a hallucination, a visual hallucination, or something that is drawing their attention away from what they should immediately be focused on, namely in this situation, our conversation. And it's not like we'd be talking and all of a sudden he'd zone out. It's just sometimes we'd talk for a while and then maybe 10 minutes into our conversation, his focus would then tend to drift, and sometimes he would just be like, okay, I need to go back and lie down on my bed, like very abruptly. And I'm like, okay, that's kind of peculiar. And that, I think, is a symptom of schizophrenia. And when I look back on Bob, I'd say that he experienced probably, at least outwardly, I should say, what was apparent to me is that he had more negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, maybe he was just back in his room and he was just listening to these auditory hallucinations. I do not know. And we didn't have a chance to talk about that when I recently met him. But from an objective standpoint, from my standpoint, all I could see is that he was very isolated, very withdrawn. And although he would socialize, he would only socialize with very few people. He would socialize with me and then maybe like one or two other patients on the unit. Other than that, he pretty much stayed to himself. So lots of negative symptoms. Didn't see a lot of positive symptoms from him. When I would do like wellness and I'd walk by his room, it's very common with people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia. You'll see them talking to themselves or responding to internal stimuli, as we like to say in the mental health field. And I never saw that with Bob. The only thing I would just see is that oftentimes he'd be under his covers, even at like 11 in the morning or at noon, he'd still be under his covers with the blanket drawn over his head. So very withdrawn. And another thing that can happen too is if you have patients that are taking large doses of antipsychotics, we know that that medication is very sedating. So oftentimes if they're taking like, say, 20 milligrams of Zyprexa, an antipsychotic, or like 300 milligrams of Seroquel, an antipsychotic at nighttime, it's very common for them to sleep through the morning because they're so tired. But in Bob's situation, although he was prescribed Zyprexa, I'm pretty sure it was 5 milligrams, he wasn't taking it. So there wasn't a medication-related reason for his sleepiness. I think it was more related to perhaps his schizophrenia. So let me share with you what's crazy about Bob. So Bob and I, we really connected very well because I used to make music a long time ago on a digital audio workstation called Ableton Live. You do everything on your computer. You press buttons that make sounds. It's very fun. It's very cool, very addicting. And Bob, and I have my own little SoundCloud account and stuff like that, Bob, he too made music as well. So we bonded. We would like get on computers. We'd talk. I'd show him like my music. He'd show me his music. We'd kind of bounce ideas off of each other and things like that. And I could tell Bob had been doing it for many years, was very experienced. He had many times very helpful pointers for me for making music. So we definitely bonded. We had that bond. He was very open with me, very honest with me. I don't feel like he was ever trying to hide anything or be clandestine with me or anything like that. So Bob, and the reason that Bob was in the hospital, I believe, was because he threatened somebody with some sort of sharp object, maybe a knife or something. And I think he might have been at like a rave or some sort of concert. And it sounded like he may have been under the influence of something and he kind of lost his mind. And so he threatened somebody, I think, with a knife. And that's how he eventually wound up in the state hospital. And there was something that I wanted to share with you guys. And now I cannot remember what it was. But anyhow, I feel like he and I had a very, very close rapport. And I do remember that he was talking with his attorney and he was talking with his mom, I believe, quite a bit on the unit. So he had some outside support, which is super helpful when you're in the state hospital. And that's pretty much all I remember about Bob in a nutshell. So anyhow, fast forward a few years. I want to make sure I'm still recording. Cool, I am. Fast forward a few years. I'm working at this correctional facility, and I think I had driven by Bob a few times. I'm like, God, is that him? But what really confused me is that he no longer had this like very long hair. He had shaved his head. I'm like, this guy that I'm looking at looks a little like he's gained a little bit of weight. He looks very similar with his posture and the way that he walks and his mannerisms and all that. I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's Bob. I had seen him like a few times just driving around because I go through the state hospital campus to get to work. So one day I pull up and I see him. I'm like, dude, I have to ask him. And I'm like, Bob, is that you? And he looks over and he's like, yeah, who's that? I'm like, hey, do you remember me? He's like, yeah, I remember you. Of course I remember you. He's like, remind me of your name. It's like, my name's Nick. He's like, oh yeah, man, how's it going? He's very friendly. You know, we start this conversation. So this is the thing that he told me that blew my mind is I asked him, you know, how you doing? He says he's doing very well. And I'm like, yeah, you seem like you're doing really great, man. He's like, yeah, I've got off-ground privileges. I'm making my own music. I get to do pretty much whatever I want. And then he said that he was, I can't remember, he's about to be, I don't want to use the word parole, but like released conditionally within the next few months. He seems like he's doing great. And I said, so tell me, like, what unit are you on? Because he used to be on this antisocial unit. Now he's on this other unit that has off-ground privileges. It's for people who are about to be released typically, right? They're like a few months to maybe a year before they get released on conditional release. So I asked him, I was like, hey, so you're doing really well. What do you think changed? And he said, honestly, man, I think it was the Zyprexa. And I was like, really? And that's the thing that blew my mind. Because Bob, if you remember, he never wanted to take that Zyprexa despite his psychiatrist adamantly wanting him to take that medication. Bob was like, I'm never going to take it. I don't need it, right? And when I saw him, I was like, I don't really know if he needs it either, but there is something a little off. And I bet that psychiatrist, she probably did a further evaluation, would have more insight if she was here with this on our video. She probably could tell us more about what her take would be on Bob and why she thought he needed the medication and why he probably had schizophrenia. But Bob actually told me that he was very thankful that he took his Zyprexa. And he said that he has insight into his illness. He says, Nick, I'm diagnosed with schizophrenia. That's what I have. He said, I didn't realize it at the time, but I have schizophrenia. And what gave me that insight was Zyprexa. I'm not making this stuff up, by the way, you guys. You already know my stance on medication. So Bob said that, and we didn't really get into the nitty gritty details of it, but he said that somehow being on Zyprexa nightly, he takes 20 milligrams a night, which if you're familiar with Zyprexa, it's typically like 5 to 20 milligrams. It's an atypical antipsychotic, causes things like metabolic issues, weight gain, constipation, hyperlipidemia. It messes up your whole like cholesterol levels and things like that, usually with most people. And then if you take it long term, you can see things like tardive dyskinesia and things like that. And Bob, he said no side effects whatsoever. And he looked like, to me, he'd probably gained 5, maybe 10 pounds of weight. And now that I know that it is Bob, I see him walk frequently outside the state hospital. So he's definitely getting some exercise in on a daily basis. But he reports no side effects whatsoever from the medication. And I don't think he's gained really that much weight whatsoever. And he says the medication has just been revolutionary for him. And he said that when he was on the medication, what he thought helped him is that he would talk to his mom on the phone, and she would repeat back things that he was telling her, which we didn't get into details. I didn't have that much time. Our conversation was probably 10 minutes before I had to get into work, right? But he said that his mom would be like, hey, do you hear what you're saying? Do you hear what you're saying? Do you hear yourself? And he thinks that because he was taking the Zyprexa, for whatever reason, it helped him listen to what he was really saying. Like his mom would say it back to him and he'd be like, oh yeah, that is like kind of off. Like I made that statement. Like that's me making that statement. That doesn't make sense. And so anyhow, that's the success story that I wanted to share with you regarding Zyprexa and Bob. We exchanged numbers and I shared with him kind of my YouTube channel and what I do and things like that. And hopefully in the near future, I will have Bob on here. He said he'd be interested in allowing me to interview him and kind of share his story. And I think it's kind of fair because I try to be as objective as possible. I know that I do tend to have certain biases when it comes to medications and things like that. But of course, I'm always open to hearing new stories and open to new information and things like that. So I really wanted to share this with you guys because it's like, hey, here's a situation when a patient finally took their Zyprexa and it said, and because of that Zyprexa, they're saying that they got enough insight to where they can see that, hey, yes, I do have a mental problem. And had I not taken the Zyprexa, I don't know if I would have had that insight. So, all right, I'm going to wrap it up there, you guys. Hope you enjoyed the story. And stay tuned for my next video, which will be coming out, who knows when. Maybe in a few months, maybe next week. I really have no idea. Bye-bye. All right, we're going to end with my 6-year-old here. He's been listening to my story. He says he actually likes my stories sometimes. It was a surprising conversation. What did you think of that story that I just said about Bob?
That was nice.
Anything, what was nice about it?
The full story.
The full story?
Uh-huh.
I have your consent to use this on YouTube?
Uh-huh.
All right, love.